There was a big case decision by the Supreme Court, I think 1 day ago, a few days ago, something like that. The short version, there's a lawsuit around birthright citizenship. So one of the cool, quirky things that Donald Trump did when he came into office.
He's such a quirky guy.
He's a quirky guy. He dropped
He's
an
a
executive
quirkster.
order ending birthright citizenship. This is blatantly against the Constitution, right? You can argue, I guess, whether or not that should be the case, but it's very clear that
How important is the Constitution?
When you go, I'll be honest with you, this was one of those things where if you go and read it, it's tough to make the argument. It's like
It's a hard steal,
back
man.
against the wall.
It is a hard
I
steal,
have the
man.
villain chair to save my life. The aliens win. Like
here is the logic. The logic from Trump is birthright citizenship, meaning if you're born in America, you automatically get citizenship, was meant to, I believe, in his words, it was about like helping slaves become citizens and guaranteeing that as emancipation happened, that everybody became a citizen. And that his argument is now it's abused where somebody like takes a trip to America while they're pregnant to like try to have a kid here and then that gives citizenship. So it's abused or whatever. So that's his argument. So he made an executive order saying that this isn't the law anymore. You cannot do that. That is so, you can't do that.
His argument was that birthright citizenship was for slaves. That's what it is.
I saw one quote of him about this. I'm sure he said 300 dumb things about this.
Okay.
One of them, he definitely said it was meant for, this was like 2 days ago.
Okay.
Maybe you guys can find the quote. But the argument is, this is being abused. It's not, it's not really being used to support citizens.
Yeah, it was the 14th Amendment. So it was in the wake of like ending slavery, and that was one of the purposes, was like to guarantee citizenship to all of the slaves that were free because they had all been born there.
Here's the Gatorade of misinformation. Again, this is the perspective of people pushing against it, is that if the idea is anybody who's born on American soil becomes a citizen, that does incentivize somebody from another country, for example, to get across the border illegally right when they're about to give birth. And if they can give birth on American soil, then their kid becomes a citizen. And that means you stem a whole business of, let's say, the cartels in Mexico being willing to traffic extremely pregnant women across the border to like try to get in this time window. That is extraordinarily dangerous. So there are these bad incentives that can happen. I don't know the specific amount of it. That's the argument.
A lot of countries around the world, I think the majority do not have birthright citizenship. I think the US and Canada, I think Canada also has it.
Canada has it?
I think so. Are two of the only ones that do.
Yeah, you can't go to Japan and have a kid and be like, cool, we got citizenship.
Can we get a fact check on that? Can we get a fact check on Canada? Anyway, I think if you want to revisit this conversation and you want to tackle the issue of birthright citizenship and change the way we just look at that in America, right? I think that is a fair conversation to have through the legal process that we have. Like if you managed to get enough cohesive opinion to amend the Constitution to adjust this going forward, we're going to be like most of the rest of the world and not have this anymore. I can understand that, right? But if you're just releasing an executive order that blatantly stands to the Constitution as it is,
right?
I see what you're
saying.
If you were to approach that process, I think it's really important that similar to dealing with immigration now, rather than deporting a bunch of people, you should be giving people amnesty, like retroactively giving green cards or citizenship to the people who are already here, and then changing the laws and changing the process going forward.
Yeah.
That's how I think this should be dealt with as well. I do think it is a fair conversation to change the rules around this. But the way it's being gone about that's the insane part.
I see what you're saying. So they went through all this work to get something amended to the Constitution, Congress, House.
They didn't do that.
No, I'm saying that
originally
to get this added, to make birthright citizenship real.
Yeah.
All American government branches worked together and made that happen. And now the president is writing executive order that undoes that.
Yeah, and the idea of us having the political will to pass an amendment in modern day is absurd, right?
Like with many things, what's supposed to happen is that Congress would amend the law if we don't like it. That's how the country is supposed to work. And then in practice, we have a president and multiple presidents now who just write executive orders, which are the lowest tier of they have lowest prio, okay? Congress and the Supreme Court, they get to overturn or change executive orders if they want. Executive order is like the lowest ranked power thing.
Not anymore.
But if nobody stops it, then it is kind of sort of implemented. So, which is what this case is, yeah.
Okay.
And that kind of loops back around to a later, I think a really important part of this, but I want you to continue. But keep this idea in your mind that we're talking about here, because I think it's the idea of Congress not being able to get anything done, because it comes back around to the logic of the Supreme Court.
It's the source of many of our problems, in fact. So, all right, so the Supreme Court ruling, the case was about Trump making an executive order that blatantly goes against the Constitution. So there's pretty much no debate that that's not okay and it's going to get shut down. But the real question, and what this came down to, is that immediately upon signing this executive order, there was a federal judge that made a universal injunction. So universal injunction is the idea that one of the federal judges, there's about 800 of them or something like that in the United States, that any one of them can place an injunction and say, here's this lawsuit about whether Trump's executive order is legitimate or not. I'm going to place an injunction that puts a pause on the entire executive order for the entire country. Any judge can say, we are fully stopping everything for everybody in America until we sort this out. And what this means in practice is that any of the federal judges, again, there are like 800 of them, can at any point when a case comes up, issue an injunction that completely stops a law that, or an act that the executive branch has done. So this particular Supreme Court case isn't really about birthright citizenship. It is about, do the judges in the American system have the ability to set a universal injunction that completely stops the law from applying that the president had just done. And historically, presidents hate this. To give you a sense of the scope of this was not a thing 100 years ago that all these judges would like essentially freeze something that the president has done. So there were basically zero 100 years ago. And then Bush, during his 8 years, there were 6 total universal injunctions. So
Which
6
Bush? Older Bush, younger Bush?
Younger Bush. So 2000 to 2008.
Mission accomplished.
Oh yeah, pull up the picture. Mission
accomplished, Bush.
So George Bush, mission accomplished. There were 6 times that a judge said, hey, I don't like this law you're doing. I'm putting a universal injunction to pause it. And then with Obama, it doubled to 12. So you might have heard of some of this stuff. Basically, a couple judges were like, we don't like what you're doing, Obama, and just put a hold on some of the stuff and like permanently stopped what he was able to do because of these injunctions. So it was 12 already by Obama. Trump's first term, 64 universal injunctions. So Trump's style is just to kind of like go, he just goes out blasting.
Executive orders.
He loves executive orders. And so judges responded by being like, you cannot do this. And they put tons of universal injunctions that stopped many of these things he was doing. For example, the Muslim travel ban. Then you had Biden. He had 14. So he had the same problem. He like during some of the COVID vaccine stuff that he was trying to do of making it mandatory, that got a universal injunction. It didn't go through because there was a right-leaning judge who was like, this isn't constitutional, and completely shut it down. And then Trump in his second term got 25 in the first 100 days.
Oh
so
my God.
Trump is just on another level in terms
Ramming
of
it
this.
down mid.
So yeah, the argument and the question that the Supreme Court was asking is, should this be allowed? Because this is only in the last couple decades. Should any judge in the federal court system be able to put this permanent pause on an entire country's law? And there is a real genuine argument for both sides, right? If you elect the president into power, imagine, right, with Trump, it's kind of different, but imagine your dream, if you're left-leaning candidate gets into power, and then everybody loves him. And there's one federal judge who just hates this person and can completely stop any of the movement and legislation that this person wants for months or years. Like this can happen. And it's, I think it is easy to understand why that can sort of be abusable. And then the counter argument is, this is a check and balance on the executive system. The whole point of this is that if Trump comes in and makes an executive order that isn't constitutional, or that there's, it's unclear the legality of it, that the judicial branch has the ability to shut it down until there is clarity around it by the Supreme Court, say. So short version, they ruled universal injunctions not cool anymore. They're technically still allowed, but 6-3 vote in the Supreme Court based on party lines. They voted these universal injunctions are an overreach. We, as the Supreme Court, we can shut down executive orders. The president shouldn't have total unlimited power here. But this idea that any one of the judges should be able to totally stop this is too much. There are some asterisks here, but that is the core of it. So now that process that can happen is gone.
So Amy Coney Barrett, one of the younger justices, she was the one who wrote the majority decision on this case. And her claim basically comes from, if this tool was always meant to be and always accessible, then why has it only started to be used from Bush onwards, basically, in the 2000s? Obviously, this was never an intended check to exist. And then the minority decision, which was pretty scathing if you go and read it. It's pretty interesting. Speaks to we're losing this check that in the future might allow infringements on things like gun rights or and things that exist on the opposite end of like the political spectrum. Because when you look at how this has affected presidencies before this, Biden also hated that this happened to him all the time. Obviously different amounts between him and Trump, but generally this use of universal injunctions is really, really recent, and it frustrates all presidents that come into power. The thing I wanted to mention here to keep in mind is that this has come primarily in the era of insane congressional gridlock, right? We're in the most like polarized, most gridlocked era of congressional politics, lowest approval ratings, and that has largely grown to be in the last 2 decades. There was more bipartisanship and more cooperation.
People hate Congress.
In the 100 years before this.
Republicans hate Congress, Democrats hate Congress.
People hate Congress more than they ever have, right?
It's like
which forces
12% approval.
It forces the hand of the executive to make decisions where they might otherwise be legislation getting passed through Congress. I think that's the main thing here, right? It's like, in order to create the change that I campaigned on, I have to make executive decisions because the congressional body doesn't have the gas to do it. And now we're in a situation where the political landscape is drastically different from when these laws and intentions were originally drawn up. And I think this is actually a hard question to answer, because I think in the short term, I agree that this check on Trump, who even by the numbers seems to be overreaching the most, is probably really important to have, right? But I do think in the long term, the idea of this being something that constantly inhibits decisions made is also not great. That was my mixed feeling when I was learning about this. Is like, it feels like a Band-Aid thing that we would want in order to stop the decisions that I don't like Trump is making. But in the real long term, I think there needs to be something better. Like, the incentive structure of politics should not be that we have to issue executive orders to do everything all the time.
Yeah. The super broken. The thing I was coming back to on this is like, it's as though any single person in Congress, of which there are also 500, something like that. I forget the total number. If any single person of Congress could completely shut down another branch of government. And that's not the case. Congress has to vote. And then if the majority votes on a thing, then they can actually implement a change. And so it feels intuitively like this doesn't make sense. Why would a single judge be able to fully lock down something of an entire? That's goes beyond a check and a balance. That's like one branch of the three having complete domination over the other. And if you remove that power, it's not like the judicial branch can't put a check and balance on Trump. They can still absolutely, the Supreme Court can come in and say, and presumably will, what you're doing with birthright citizenship is not legal. Congress can also do that. I think, again, it's what you're saying. Like to me, my intuition is that the problem here is that Congress doesn't do anything anymore. Congress is supposed to be one of the checks and balances. And if that's completely gone and you're leaving it entirely up to the judicial branch, then the judicial branch is going to want extra power to make sure they can curtail what the president's doing, because the president is doing way too much because Congress isn't doing anything. Like, the balance is all fucked.
Yeah, I see everything you're saying, and I guess I agree. It's spooky because we're in a spot where the executive wants as much power as possible.
Yes.
And we have no other check right now. That's the only remaining check.
On him specifically. Presumably, if you had, like, if a Democrat gets elected after this, right? I feel like when it comes to Supreme Court decisions, they aren't likely to be leaning in that person's favor.
Right. Or if there's midterm elections that go a different way or whatever. But, for right now, that is the only check. And maybe...
So one other interesting thing about the majority opinion from Barrett.
Wait, this is done, This is done and dusted, right? They ruled.
Yeah, they made the decision.
Yeah, okay.
So there is some confusion here after this decision as well. But I wanted to note one other thing besides that, which was, in the absence of these checks, what's your opinion for besides Supreme Court decisions, then what system do we have to check federal power anymore? Like, what do you think of that? And Barrett wrote that, well, you still have class action lawsuits. But this creates a problem where in order to gather a class action lawsuit, you need like the money, the time, and the resources. So now you've turned the check process into a monetary one. It isn't something that is accessible to the average person. A normal person who might have the ability to challenge one of these executive orders in court probably does not have the money or the time or the resources to combat that. So it's like a half, like here you still have class actions to deal with this, but it's not really equivalent or realistic that they will be used in that way.
Yeah, a clarification there. So this isn't saying that this ruling isn't saying a judge can't put an injunction to stop a law. The difference is whether it's universal. So if you right now sue Trump and you say this executive order you just did about birthright citizenship, that's bullshit. And the judge says, okay, I'm going to put an injunction and pause the law for you. That's what an injunction is meant to be. It's like the people involved in that specific case can get an injunction and they have basically, immunity from the law until the case is resolved. A universal injunction is where you sue Trump and me as the judge says, on behalf of everybody in the entire country, I'm putting a pause on the law for everybody. So what this ruling is doing is saying a judge can still put a pause on anything that Trump does with an injunction, but it can only cover the people in the lawsuit. You can't proactively cover everybody else. So in a class action, the reason that becomes more valuable now is because if you do a class action lawsuit and get, what you're representing, let's say, an entire giant swath of people, the judge can now put an injunction on that, cover all of those people. So that might happen now. And that's one of the criticisms of this as well, is like now people are just going to flood the courts with cases because instead of getting a universal injunction for everybody from a law that overreaches, every individual party is going to have to go and make their own lawsuit. So it's going to be this like cluster of just cases going on.
So and the ramification that I think people are really worried about and what the minority opinion had been writing about is because this injunction doesn't exist anymore, can you as the executive, because this is an example where it feels so blatantly unconstitutional, right?
Yep.
So if you as the executive can issue any order, like one of the examples was guns. If I just issue my executive order that says all Americans have to turn in their firearms, now the theory is that stands until it goes through the entire process up to the Supreme Court decision. And I can act on that in the meantime, even though we all recognize that it's blatantly unconstitutional.
Yeah.
I can act out the consequences of my executive order for as long as it takes for that to get to the Supreme Court decision.
Which is a huge problem.
Which seems crazy.
Yeah, it's a big problem. It's not coincidence that this is happening right when we have a president who is trying to use more executive power than literally ever, and it's basically that question of like, this system would hamper any president, and then here's the person who's pushing it as far as can possibly go. And again, I just want to reiterate that Congress should be one of the checks. Congress should be able to pass a law that overrides or nullifies what an executive order is doing, but we basically have lost one of the three branches because they can't do anything. Atriarch, what is the conclusion of this?
You guys didn't solve shit. You guys are debating back and forth, and I thought one of you would just tell me what the solution is.
We came to you.
Dude, it's one of many instances where I'm like, dude, this is really complex. There's a lot of issues back and forth. I can really see pros and cons. I wish Congress had their shit together, man. I wish Congress actually did their job.
You know what we should do an episode on is what we think went wrong with Congress. Because I remember reading about how there was eras, 70s, early 80s, where there were constant bipartisan votes. People voted on many different areas, and it has slowly but surely split. And I wonder what the incentives were that made it that way.
I have a theory. War.
War?
Not kidding. When Congress is most united, it's when there's a national enemy, right? It's when the Soviet Union is the big enemy, and then everybody, coalesces around a single movement. We have to take down and then there's some dissent within that. And then the Cold War ends and everything becomes kind of a disaster until 9/11, right? And then suddenly we're insanely united. Approval rating of Congress goes through the roof, and then it deteriorates over the next couple of years. And there is a world that I'm not happy about, but I think is quite likely, where we enter into a cold or hot war with China more explicitly, and then everybody organizes around that like we're on a sports team. And that's maybe the way out. Not saying it's good. I don't want that. No, but like historically, that's when we unite, right? It's war.
I was actually thinking Iran. I was actually thinking boots on the ground in Iran.
And then suddenly we're all...
We rally behind that.
I hope that is not the solution.
Tell me I'm wrong about that.
I do...
I think
I won't disagree that it's a unifier to have an outside enemy. I do disagree that is the only reason, the only incentive that is causing people to become more not bipartisan, but more polarized.
Sure. I'm saying the times where it didn't happen, it's usually when there's an enemy.
What if the enemy is poverty?
Whoa. I mean, to be clear, I agree with you, by the way. I don't like
No.
this.
I see what you're saying. I just the idea that China needs to invade Taiwan for us to get our Congress to work. So you can see how that is an unappealing future for me to live in.
What if the enemy is poverty? I feel like that's you joke, but isn't that kind of what populism is? You're rallying behind the idea of like the working class versus the elites. I'm not saying that's necessarily translating, but I think it's why there's this weird pocket of people who work factory jobs that flip-flop between Democrats and Republicans because, Trump managed to speak to some working class sentiment. And then, I understand that when you dig into this, it doesn't actually make sense. But people who are like, yeah, I like Bernie, but now that he's out, like, I'll vote Trump like 4 years from now. There's a reason that happens. It's like there's some crossover here of like united working class thinking, like anti-poverty.
Well, I want to jump on this
that you can
because there's a guy, James Ganesh, who wrote a piece in the FT basically saying, if you look at history, democracies work best in a crisis. And I don't think it necessarily has to be a foreign war or an invasion.
Yeah.
Just with enough
COVID
people.
is an example.
If there's something that we all agree is a problem that is now unignorable, because he also said people will ignore it as long as they fucking can. As long as you can keep this train on the rails, as rickety as it is, they'll keep going. But once there's a crisis, then everyone sort of agrees like we gotta make something.
What if we make a crisis?
So you're saying
manufacture a crisis, a false flag,
right? You make one up.
Like
we hire people to very
flag.
convincingly act like aliens, right? And we're like, guys, we gotta pass some laws about CEQA.
Dude, it's us three in alien outfits, and we say, if you guys don't get poverty together, we're invading this.
Damn.
And then you see the Senate, and they're shaking hands. We don't want to get invaded.
I think we got to take one for the team.
Mission accomplished.
This is the most brilliant solution yet. This is the most brilliant solution yet. Fuck.
It could work. It could work is all I'm saying.